Good morning. My name is Dr. Paul Kershaw. I'm a policy professor at the University of BC School of Population Health and founder of Generation Squeeze. We promote fairness for every generation so all can count on a healthy childhood, a healthy home, a healthy retirement, and a healthy planet. Generation Squeeze has come to Ottawa to urge the federal government to renew the National Housing Strategy. Canada has now enjoyed 3 straight years of stalled home prices. According to the latest data from the Canadian Real Estate Association, national home values are down by about 1% from last year and 4% from their 2022 peak. Adjusted for inflation, average prices today are roughly where they were in 2020 as the pandemic was beginning. That is progress, and credit to governments for making progress. But it's not nearly enough. Home prices had already surged out of control well before COVID, especially in British Columbia and Ontario. Returning to 2020 levels in those provinces means returning to home prices that were already out of reach for most young adults. And meanwhile, prices in other provinces have continued to climb. So it will be essential for the Carney government to renew and substantially improve Canada's National Housing Strategy. Launched in 2017 as a 10-year plan, the Parliamentary Budget Officer now shows that federal spending will drop by more than half after 2027 if that strategy is not renewed. And those cuts would directly counter the Prime Minister's promise of generational investments in housing. They also expose the gap between promises and plausible outcomes. Mr. Carney, we know, has spoken about doubling the pace of home building in this country, yet the PBO estimates that his first budget will increase supply by roughly 2%, not 100. So renewing the national strategy offers a chance to do better. The original version was a step forward, but it avoided several hard truths that can no longer be ignored. First, housing policy must acknowledge an uncomfortable intergenerational reality. The dramatic rise in home prices over the past quarter century enriched those who already owned homes, people like me, mostly boomers and Gen X, by shifting costs onto those who followed. Millennials and Gen Z now pay the price through higher rents and mortgages that consume far more of their incomes than earlier generations faced. Their housing insecurity finances the housing wealth gained by older generations. The initial national housing strategy never confronted that tension. The next version must. It needs to grapple openly with the fact that the goals of younger people, lower rents and attainable home ownership, conflict with the desire of many existing owners to maintain, if not increase, their housing wealth. We are not going to fix housing affordability without an honest conversation about what this tension implies for home prices. Do we want them to rise, stall, or fall? The next national housing strategy must minimally judge that prices should stop climbing. Otherwise, new entrants to our housing market will remain trapped by unaffordable prices. Reasonable people can disagree about how much housing prices should fall or whether long-term stalling is enough, but that debate needs to be brought into public view and start right now. Second, the next housing strategy has to repair a broken feedback loop between the way we measure housing inflation and monetary policy. Ultra-low interest rates helped fuel the surge in home prices during the pandemic, while rapid rate hikes helped stall them thereafter. But throughout that cycle, Canada's official measure of inflation, the Consumer Price Index, played down housing inflation by only tracking existing homeowners' continuing expenses rather than the experience younger people faced from skyrocketing costs that impeded their buying a home. And the result was cheaper credit for a longer period of time, which pushed prices higher and deepened insecurity for those trying to enter the market. Happily, Statistics Canada already has a solution. It has tested what it calls an acquisition approach to measuring housing inflation that does so in a way that tracks younger Canadians' experience by measuring the full cost of purchasing a home, including its land. Adopting that measure would help ensure monetary policy doesn't fuel the very housing inflation it is meant to control. And finally, It is time to ask more for those who gained the most. Many older homeowners, including me, benefited enormously from the lottery of rising home prices. While some try to offset that advantage in their families by helping their children with rent and a mortgage, that is not a policy solution. That resembles Canada becoming more like a landed aristocracy. A strong public policy response would ask older Canadians with six-figure incomes and housing wealth to receive smaller old age security subsidies so the savings can be repurposed in part to address housing insecurity for younger generations. Ottawa currently plans for OAS to expand by tens of billions of dollars to meet the needs of an aging population. Yet federal support for housing is scheduled to shrink sharply after 2027. In other words, governments will borrow billions to protect older Canadians' wallets, even when they have significant income and wealth, yet hesitate to invest at a scale that will ensure the foundation for younger Canadians enables them to build stable lives. If the National Housing Strategy version 2.0 does not confront that funding imbalance directly, the housing crisis will easily outlive the strategy meant to solve it. Thank you.
Nous n'avons pas de questions pour le moment. We don't have any questions at the moment. Is there something you would like to add to your statement?
Yes, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have made some progress. It wasn't that long ago when we couldn't imagine prices doing anything other than rising. And people were banking, in many respects, their financial planning around those rising prices, which comes at such a significant cost for younger people because what is driving my wealth is causing the unaffordability for those who follow in my footsteps. Even if they work just as hard as I do and are just as smart as I am and have just as good a paying job, the fact that the rising values in homes has given me economic security is meaning they can't live where I live. So the fact that the home prices has stalled is really important. And we need to give governments, federal and provincial, some credit for this because we often rile at them when prices rise, blaming them. So I think we as citizens and voters need to acknowledge the progress that has been made, but not be satisfied with that progress. And start the difficult intergenerational conversation that really is at the heart of our housing challenge. Rising home values aren't uniformly good or uniformly bad. It all depends on when you got into the housing market. And for some of us, like me, who's been in the housing market for decades, those rising home values have increased my wealth by over $1 million. But for those who follow, it has meant that they are stuck renting for longer periods of time, if not indefinitely, that their dreams of home ownership are crushed, that their ability to find housing either as a renter or owner that can accommodate their having children is further out of reach. These are massive hardships we have placed on younger Canadians. And in many respects, it is time for us all to acknowledge that millennials and Gen Z, in many respects, are being asked to sacrifice their standard of living because the political bargain in this country is that we want to maintain home values at least where they are. And where they are is pretty good for me, but it's really lousy for my Gen Z and millennial colleagues. The next national housing strategy must wrestle with that tension. Otherwise, we'll never solve housing unaffordability in this country.
One question, please. I'm Brendan Hennigan from APTN.
Wonderful.
I've read several of your articles, and you say about the moral issue to do with older generation maybe giving back money or being taxed. But one of the things that isn't mentioned is land value. The price of land goes up, and that's, they talk very little about that. What would your strategy have to sort of cushion so that the land prices don't go up?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for raising the issue of land value specifically. So that is at the heart of the generation squeeze analysis that I've been sharing for many years now, and including in today. Notice when I talk about the problem of how the way we measure housing inflation, rising home values, that's actually fueled in part because the consumer price index doesn't track land values. It doesn't track the cost of actually buying a home, which is in no small part the value of the land that it sits on. And because we're not tracking that, we're then sending the wrong signal to monetary policy. we are, if we're not tracking that land value is going up, then the Bank of Canada can't really say, oh, we are going to organize our monetary policy to help downplay that land value inflation. So that's one piece. And the second absolutely goes to your question of the wealth that I have gained in my home in Metro Vancouver is not because my building is any nicer. It's a 1,500 square foot home. It's 20 years older now than when I bought it. But the land has gone up by more than $1 million. It's that land value surge that is making it more costly to build new housing, affordable housing, cooperative housing, because it's hard for nonprofits to buy it when the value has gone up. So absolutely, we need to engage in a conversation in this country, those who have benefited from rising home values. Now, they often would have worked hard as nurses and bus drivers and people, doing regular blue and white collar jobs back in the 70s and 80s and bought homes in Victoria and Hamilton or Vancouver and Toronto as regular folks. But because what's happened to their land values, they've soared so much that they now have millions in assets, and they're actually part of the global 1%. Now, we don't necessarily feel that way, but the reality is that the wealth that has come from rising land values has done just that. And so we need to be having the next national housing strategy talk seriously about your very question. Land values have surged. They're creating winners and losers. How can we soften that imbalance, in part by asking those who've benefited to be a bigger part of the solution? And that may be contributing more. It may be, as I'm suggesting today, taking less in subsidies from government when you're financially secure and you've gained that housing wealth. I suspect that's the easier political path forward. But just the conversation matters. And if you read the National Housing Strategy, version 1.0, it dodges that issue entirely. It never once mentions the word wealth, which means they're not tracking what's happened to land values over time. And if you're not mentioning the word wealth, you're not really understanding why in Canada have we tolerated home values rising so much over the last quarter century. And because the answer is rising land values made people like me wealthier, more secure. And that reality has to be better reflected in the National Housing Strategy 2.0.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.
Merci.